Hello, everybody. My name is Sara Amin, and I'm the Senior Lecturer of Sociology with the School of Law and Social Sciences at the University of the South Pacific. I'll be talking today on a little bit about preparing academic papers and journal submission. I'll be drawing on my experiences as part of the editorial board of the Journal of Sociology, which is the official journal for the Australian Association of Sociology. And I will also draw on my experiences of publishing as well, and responses from editors and so on. So to start us off, so something I found very useful when talking to colleagues as well as postgraduate students, and for myself in thinking about writing and preparing academic writing for publication or conference presentations and so on, is Raynell Connell's work on writing for research. It is a freely available set of mini essays that he's written that provide us, I think, a very reflective way and at the same time a very practical way to do writing for the academic space. I'll quote from her work over here. Writing is a specialized form of labor. It is specifically communicative work, so it is useful to apply ideas from the sociology of communication. Among other things, this encourages us to think of the audience for any piece of writing, how that audience is reached, and what the writing does for its readers. It is very important for researchers to think about who they're writing to, as that awareness shapes the writing itself. And as we'll see today as I do my presentation, that there is this relationship between what you're writing and who you're writing to, and it's an iterative, dynamic kind of process. And being conscious about that is very important, I think, in preparing a piece of work for a specific journal. Writing for research is a specific form of also communication, and that too needs attention. It is part of a collective process of making knowledge. So it is also helpful to apply ideas from the sociology of intellectuals and the sociology of knowledge, as that field is being reshaped in post-colonial time, especially with questions about the knowledge production process and the power dynamics in it, the expectations that are there that might be disadvantaging or privileging for certain ways of speaking, certain ways of writing, certain ways of communicating. And so, and it's also important to think through that a writer's relations with previous and future workers in the same domain is also important. That when you're writing to and for, in some sense, those that are around you, those that might evaluate you, those that you would want to see your work, hear your work, listen to your work. Um, and so thinking about that also will shape your writing. And so are the epistemes and knowledge frameworks to which the work relates. And paying attention to, for example, a journal's epistemological framing or theoretical underpinnings or inclinations become really important in considering who do you want your work to be in conversation with. And that's, I mean, that's also embedded in the literature that you engage with in your writing, but also kind of thinking about the journal itself. And not just the literature around per se, because some of the choices you make for the literature will also be influenced by the spaces in which you want to or choose to publish in. With that background, we can also look at writing for research not as a great mystery, but as an understandable labor process. Different genres within this labor process involve different audiences and styles, and like other forms of labor, writing involves skills that can be learned and refined. And like other forms of labor, it also involves a creative and purposive dimension, and it is all the better for reflection and discussion. And I mean, I think it's really important to keep these ideas very central in the writing process, because it's with all the publisher perish kind of pressures and so on. We get caught in the doing without kind of looking at where the doing is embedded, and to be able to do the work that will lead to kind of the outputs and the outcomes that you want. I think getting a more holistic kind of awareness of the writing process itself becomes very helpful in that in these goals and aspirations. So, in terms of going down to how to write a journal or article and practical steps, Connell breaks it down into the following kind of steps. Sorry, the epitome, the argument, the first draft, the revision, the presentation of your paper, and the publication. I will talk about some of those other elements as we go through, but one of the things that I find that Connell kind of puts to the front, and it is something that's often missing when we talk about in writing workshops and so on, is what she calls the epitome, which she describes as kind of the summary of your findings, um, the the so what in some sense of your research that you're trying to um, share, and really kind of thinking through over here, and she suggests, for example, being able to put this down in one page, either by handwriting or by typing, but kind of really thinking through the connections, the linkages of what your findings really mean, what questions are they raising, what are the statistical significance if you're doing quantitative work that of relationships or variables that you want to highlight, what are the stories if you're working with qualitative data, what are the stories that are kind of core to showing what you want to argue. So really getting a sense of that, but in a very kind of constrained space, so to speak, so that it helps you focus in on what do you want to really say. And in some sense, without clarity on that, the other elements become really hard to write. So, uh, spending time on that particular this particular step of really identifying what do you want to really say from this piece of research or for this component of research. What is the really the goal of this? How does it relate to kind of what you know about the field or the area? What questions does it raise? What's the key, the most interesting data story you can tell around it, and being able to put down within the limits of, let's say, one page, that becomes really central in helping us kind of like have a have a good sense of what you want to say, what we want to say. And by doing that, it gives us then a space to start looking at also where do you want to say it, okay, and doing the rest of it. Um, so I like to think of the entire preparing for the an academic paper process as this cycle and feedback and back and forth between these questions of what do I want to say, why does it matter, where do I want to say it, how do I say it, where have others said this, and how have others said this. And the where part is important in both identifying journals as well as identifying the audience, as well as identifying the disciplines, and the disciplinary spaces in which you want your work to be be part of. And the how do I say it, and how others have said it, in some sense requires learning the discursive practices of a particular field or area or field or discipline or area of studies, and learning kind of the tricks around it, learning kind of the styles, the language around it, because these things do come back in how editors and reviewers are going to be reading your work, uh, and um, And this is not to say you have to fit in exactly into a particular template. Uh, but when you have clarity on what you want to say and why does it matter, then thinking about these other questions allows you to be more aware of if you are challenging certain understandings or norms or styles, and then being able to be explicit about why you're challenging it and why is it important to do it differently, for example. So these kinds of, and this is also where post-colonial questions about the knowledge production process itself can become important. But the more you're able to anticipate these issues or these questions to maybe how you're preparing your work or how you're doing it, the more you can prepare also the arguments or the sometimes many journals give you the space to also provide a cover letter that explains the importance of the work or some choices that you've made about the work. And those kinds of narratives allow facilitate it for editors and reviewers to place your work, to situate it, to relate it, and to understand what you're trying to do. So keeping those things in mind and these questions in mind are really useful, I think, and thinking of them in this relational, cyclical way in the writing process is helpful in trying to prepare a work that is received and read in a way that is understood for what you're trying to do with it. So, in these questions of what do I want to say and where do I want to say it, like I think I've iterated this earlier on, in terms of what do I want to say, it's really important that you're able to identify the key argument that you want to make. Often, one of the things that uh, editors will often reject right off the board is when an article is trying to do too much, when there are too many arguments. And sometimes this is the hardest when we're going from a dissertation into and trying to publish elements of our dissertation. We kind of have the big picture of our dissertation, but then we need to, in our articles, actually often narrow it down to something very focused, very specific. And because there's in some ways very limited space and you need to be able to do everything to build it and show it, and as a result you want the key argument to be a very focused, very precise point that you're trying to make, and so in some sense you need to think of the larger body of work that you're working with in this, and an article being kind of a step towards other arguments as well. Identify what is the story that you want to tell. Why does it matter that it's said? Why does this argument matter? The more clarity you have on that, the easier it is to write the paper and the easier it is to figure out where you want to say it. Because when you're looking at trying to make choices about where you want to publish, what kinds of arguments are related to your research area, are made in the journal or journals that you're looking for, is an important question. So if you're looking at a few journals and then seeing what types of arguments about your topic are being made in that journal becomes really central in trying to figure out how do I fit into this? Where does my argument fit into what has been said in this journal related to this larger topic? Um, how does your paper story speak to the aims and the scopes of the journal? You especially, I think it's important, I think, to pay attention to the journal's theoretical takes. The journals can be political spaces. Some journals, like which are, you know, journals will have methodological, epistemological, and theoretical trends or biases, so to speak, and paying attention to that is important, because if your research or your way of doing it is not aligned to those elements, then it's highly possible that it will not be seen as appropriate for the journal. And and not just the journal's theoretical lens, but also its aims and scope. So, for example, for a long time, the Journal of Sociology that I meant that I was part of had been very focused on basically Australia and a little bit of New Zealand and so on. But they took a very explicit kind of decision with the last editorial board, and that has continued with the current to make it much more an international focus. And so when it had a more Australia focus, it would have not made sense to try to publish in a journal like that. So just even those kinds of things become important, even if it's called something that seems very inclusive. It might not be in the way it's working, and for that, it's also really good to look at the editorial board's research areas, where they're from, what disciplines they're involved in, what topics they are, because that will also give you a sense of the networks that they reach out for when they get reviewers, and those types of network-based relationships will tend to also highlight the political, the theoretical, the expectations, the way of writing, and so on that's out there, the types of questions that reviewers might pose. So these types of things are important questions to ask yourself in choosing where do you want to say it, and obviously the answers to that will shape the way you write your paper as well, or how you anticipate the criticisms or questions that may come. um, some other things to think about that sometimes we forget when we're starting off, but it's important in a very practical and important way, especially given how academic institutions have been working, is looking at how do your institutions evaluate that journal. If your institution basically doesn't value a particular journal that you want to publish in, you need to think about, is it worth it for me to do this in this particular journal, or should I look for somewhere else? And then sometimes that can be in tension with how your own discipline evaluates that journal. So maybe sociology, maybe this journal is really important for social movements, but is not highly valued by the university that you work for. When that happens, what are you going to do? And I think those come back to then thinking about the question of your current and future workers, like Connell was saying. What are your plans for who again who you want to be reading your work, who you want to be citing your work, because sometimes you might want to maybe for the short run, publishing in an journal that is ranked highly might work against you, in the sense that no one that the people that you're interested in having a conversation with, they're not reading that journal that much. So these are, and that can affect also your citations and your impact, and which then are other things institutions use to measure you. So thinking about these things seriously and consciously, I think, has become important in the preparation of the academic paper process. Other things to keep in mind: journals have journals can have very varied times in how long it takes for a paper that you send and submit, and a decision around it, and that's made around it, and then the publication time itself. There's more and more different types of databases and platforms that are developing to try to give us a better sense of what's there for that. Some journals will have this kind of information on their own websites, but others won't. So looking for that information, or finding out if you know someone who's published in that journal, to find out how long it took. These things can make a big difference in thinking through how long your paper might get stuck in a place, and also learning about how many reviewers are often need, like what are the rules about the number of reviewers. Some journals, for example, require 5 reviewers, other journals required 1, other journals require 2. So when these kinds of things are there, it's important to it makes a difference in the length of time, and as well as the complexity of dealing with revisions or the likelihood of rejections and so on. Looking at also how often does the journal publish. Do articles get published only do articles get published online is another new thing that's important. And it allows a faster turnaround time, so to speak, at least at the publication point. And keeping an eye out for call for papers for special issues, because those often help you figure out the first set of questions about where you want to say it and what are the theoretical, epistemological, and and political dynamics involved in it. Those special issues can be quite useful for kind of solving those questions, and getting more support, at least from the editors at the beginning of it. Just another thing, sometimes editors will right away reject a paper saying that it doesn't fit the aims or scopes of the journal, or that it's not ready, before they send it out even to the reviewers. There can be a good thing for that in that it doesn't get stuck for a long time. But it can be also helpful when you get that kind of a response to write back to ask for some guidance or advice, or sometimes to challenge it and ask, if you think the argument that's being made doesn't make sense, because then in most journals, there's an obligation to then send it out to reviewers as well. So these are things to keep in mind as well. In these final couple of slides, the question comes down then to how do I say it? And Connell, in the paper that I mentioned, and the link was up there, is goes through kind of the other kind of practical steps around it. But I think some key questions around this is, um, paying specially attention to the evidence of the argument that you're making and the quality of your methodology and data analysis, um, and being able to clearly identify what are your findings, and how you're going to create a good story about your findings. These sometimes some of the often we get papers that have spent quite a bit of time on the literature, on the conceptualizations and so on, but often then the actual data or evidence to show the argument that the author or authors want to make, that's often missing, or not well developed. And when that's not there, there is a greater worry on the part of reviewers and editors that the paper might not be salvageable, so to speak. Often when the methods, the data and the quality of the methodology and the analysis and the story that's being told is strong, but the literature or the theoretical framing might need more work, there's actually a greater chance that you'll get more reviewers guiding you or editors guiding you towards where how to frame it, than if it's the other way around. So paying attention to this and really being able to bring the evidence to your argument out, is very, very important. And then it is important to be able to link your work to, like, the when you're writing it about the debates, theories, and stories that your paper speaks to, that it challenges. And like we said earlier, the where of this matters as well, whether it's disciplinary or journal based as well as audience based. And it's important to kind of think through the recent events in these debates. Sometimes we tend to keep using the body that we know or that we engaged with during our dissertation, or after a few years, the work that we've become comfortable with, and we stop in some sense following maybe other debates that are taking place in this space, or in the space that you're engaging with. Being able to show your awareness of it and linking your work to what it's saying in relation to these recent developments, is very important, because often reviewers will kind of see these gaps or identify these gaps. Um, and the other thing to remember is that, especially when we're and this is about thinking about your audience again, but when we're preparing a paper for more wider disciplinary journals, like Journal of Sociology, or the Anthropological Journal of American Anthropology, the Journal of British Sociology, or so to speak, or just broad-based ones, it's going to be important to provide context. And this is particularly important because I think for most of us as scholars locate doing research and working in the global south, that many of the reviewers that are brought into the brought into the reviewers process are mainly located still in the global north, are mainly familiar, and this is in part because of what the editorial teams of journals often look like, that they're mainly familiar with northern context, northern stories, northern histories, and so a lot of what we might be writing about might be unfamiliar. And so providing enough contextual information, knowledge around it becomes really important. And this goes back to also, as well, kind of highlighting the debates, theories, and stories in this context, in the context that you're writing from. And I think without that kind of explicit engagement with the context that you're writing from and with, you can lose the editors or or the reviewers, and it can be by some reviewers misunderstood, misinterpreted, and this is why. Again, thinking through and doing some research around who the editorial board is and therefore how much context you might need to provide. And then at the very end, I mean, these are things that are in some sense obvious, but important to keep in mind is take the instructions for authors that are there, especially in relation to word limits and overall clarity in writing. Most journals expect some form of proofreading done and some uh, standard level of lack of errors grammatically and things like that. Some journals are starting to provide kind of services around this, but it's often pay for services. And there's a couple of journals, for example, in Latin America, that have taken a very explicit stand on this because they recognize the power dynamics that and power inequalities that this can reproduce in knowledge production. So they are providing very concerted efforts and free services for proofreading, for the clarity of writing in a technical sense, so to speak. So these are, but most journals won't. So you'll have to kind of think through, are there people you can ask help from? It's always a good idea to get your paper read by several colleagues that you trust to give you constructive feedback and guidance. Um, Sometimes reading a paper to those that are not in the discipline can be helpful. It often helps us. It can help us to write more clearly. Do pay attention to the way that quantitative versus qualitative versus mixed methods and theoretical and review papers are structured in the journal that you're writing in, because generally using those templates and then playing around with it, but generally using those templates makes it easier to both for the reviewers and editors to follow, as well as for you to kind of think through how you want to say something. Um, it's becoming more and more common for multiple reasons and pushes to write collaboratively, and this can help in the writing process a lot. It can make it a more explicit collective experience, and I think and it can make the different knowledge and expertise that people bring to the writing process into one place. But I think there's some things to keep in mind when writing collaboratively as well. One, probably the most important, is write with people who respect you and who you trust. You don't want your work to be devalued or distorted or taken advantage of. But but in terms of the other thing to be careful about is, does it read like one piece of writing versus does it read like three different people wrote three different sections? And again, these are, I mean, the more shared the discursive practices become, I guess the less our voices come through. So it can work, but kind of while different people can take charge of different sections, then kind of redistributing that work in the revision process can be very important and helpful, to make it sound like, because if it doesn't sound like one coherent piece when you're working with other people, then it's again something that reviewers and editors will obviously point to. And I think I've gone over my time by quite a bit, so I'll stop here. But just would like to emphasize that the key to preparing an academic paper for publication, I think, is first really thinking about what you want to say it, what are the evidence that what evidence will you use to make that argument, and then who do you want to be listening to your argument, and what do they tend to say, um, and then being able to anticipate in some sense what they might ask or say to then be able to incorporate that into the way you build your argument. I think those are the things that really matter, and when those things are put together in put together in a coherent way, in an organized way that tells a clear, focused story, basically, it's it's very likely that you will be able to get the acceptance to a journal. But again, paying attention to the journal's editorial board, its aims and scopes, its leanings in theory and methodology and so on, and its geographical or social kind of missions will be important. So I hope that will be helpful. Thank you very much.